Jill said, my name is Brian Cornack. I'm a professor and department head here at K-State in the Department of Entomology. I've been here about 14 years. This is actually my second year on the board. And it is really an honor to be president of this amazing team. They really bring in various strengths and interests to our goals this coming year, which I'll be talking about here just in a little bit. And then I think we've got some other board members. So maybe if you just want to kind of pop your camera on real quick and just kind of give a little wave to, I'm not sure if I see everybody on there, but yeah, I think I see Jim, and I thought I saw Kelly. Retta was in there, and Jill, and who else is on? Am I missing? But yeah, go ahead and give a nice little wave. You can say hi. Again, it's always nice to see a few faces at least when we're welcoming everybody to Cure for Cabin Fever, which is today. I think the timing is pretty good considering the weather has been a little chilly and snowy the last week or so. And I want to thank all of you for joining as Friends of Konza Prairie for this particular event. Oh, there I see John. Hey, John. And I also want to thank Jeff Watson for organizing this event and introducing our speaker today, Dave Kendall. So not only thanks to Jeff for organizing all that, because I know that takes a significant amount of work, but also thanks to Dave for presenting to us today, giving us some things to think about. Also, I talked about the goals that we've got for the board this year, and they seem, I think, pretty simple for the most part, but actually maybe a little bit more audacious in terms of membership. And so, when Jim reached out to me here a couple of years ago and asked me to serve on the board, I was just vaguely familiar with what Friends was. And now after being on the board, I want everybody to know about it. And I think all of you are here today because of your connection to the prairie in some shape or form. And this whole idea of expanding membership is really to just make sure that people are aware of what Konza Prairie really means to the research community in terms of the thousands of publications that literally come from the prairie over the last over decades worth of continuous research. And John Blair can definitely attest to that. To the Konza Environmental Education Program that Jill directs and does a tremendous job giving thousands of kids experiences on the prairie that cannot be beat. Those hands-on, really influential times to experience the prairie really do shape lives. So there's really lots of great reasons to kind of share the word. And so we came up with this really simple campaign. I actually stole it from our Entomological Society a few years ago because it made sense, but this whole idea of each one reaching one. And so I'm quite sure that all of you know maybe somebody that does enjoy the prairie on some level, but maybe hasn't become a member yet. And this is really an opportunity for you to maybe just reach out and have a really brief conversation. No, I'm not looking for you to be on the corner spinning signs, but if you want one of those, I think Kelly would be happy to design one for you. But really, this is like, casual conversations, whether it's coffee groups, church groups, sporting events, you're talking to somebody, and it's one of those opportunities to share your story. I know I talked about this at the September meeting, which is great, by the way. It was fun to see all of you there. But really, this is an opportunity to kind of just, hey, this is what Friends of Konza Prairie means to me. There's some of the benefits, but really kind of the bigger mission of what we're trying to do, which is tell everybody about the great research that happens there. And really that can only happen with support from all of you. So again, this idea of start small, not asking everybody to reach 100 different people, but just one. And so even with that, I think we'd be able to reach that goal this year, at least in creating awareness. So in case you're not familiar, I'm going to throw this into the chat, but we do have a page that is here that has a really quick link that takes you right to, actually, maybe I'll just share my screen real quick. That takes you to, let's not let me share my desktop. That's okay. It takes you to a place where you can instantly become a member. So the foundation has created a really quick and easy link for us to share this message with other people. And the other thing I wanted to bring to your attention was John had helped the foundation put together a really nice article about what gifts to the Konza Prairie Biological Station really do mean in terms of research. So It's one of those where we're just trying to get the word out. If you want to share this in any which way you can, it'd be really greatly appreciated. And with that, again, I want to welcome all of you for taking time this afternoon to, again, connect with everybody else, all these other prairie aficionados. And I'm actually going to give this mic over to Jill to kind of give us a report from Keep.
Thanks, Brian. And thank you all for being here. And one second, I need to, okay. Days like today remind us that spring is coming and there is hope. So it's great to see the sun out today. I do need to make a couple of announcements. The first one is that Keep has a new assistant environmental educator, and it's Retta Kramer. And Retta, if you would turn your video back on. Many of you already know her because she is a docent. There she is. She's a docent and also an FOKP board member, as well as being incredibly experienced and knowledgeable. She's a longtime educator and administrator. And so she will be the new assistant environmental educator. I am super excited and lucky to have her. So thank you, Retta. And I know we all welcome you to your new label, Keep employees. So thank you for joining us, and welcome back from the Texas Gulf Coast. We're happy to have you back, tanned and rested. A couple of other things that I wanted to share with you is that as we are approaching spring, we are taking reservations for spring visits to KPBS. So if you know of some school groups who are interested in coming out and are able to, with COVID, we're still not sure exactly what to expect, but we are prepared to do outdoor activities with whatever school groups want to come out. We did end up having a very busy fall semester, so we are prepared and preparing for a busy spring semester as well. New docent training begins on March 1st. We have 8 people signed up for that so far. If you are interested in that, I've got 2 more spots open for that. It is limited to 10 this year. The other big announcement is, unfortunately, because of COVID, we're not going to be able to offer prairie chicken viewing again this year. We just can't. We can't consciously, in good conscience, have 8 people packed in a small environment watching prairie chickens. So it's not a safe environment right now. Maybe next year. The prairie chickens have now had 3 years off, and so it might be a completely different viewing experience the next time we see them. 2 other things. The Summer Teachers Workshop is happening this June. It'll be the 3rd week of June. If you know of a teacher who's interested in learning more about our program. And for FOKP, go ahead and put it on your calendar. Sunday, June 5th is the Wildflower Walk. So we are already starting to make plans for that. And with that, I will pass it off to Dr. John Blair, the director of the Konza Prairie Biological Station, for his report. Maybe. Are you there, John? There he is.
Yeah, hi. Am I?
You're on.
Okay, great. Yeah, I don't have a formal report to offer this year. I just would like to say welcome. I'm happy that you were able to join us virtually this year. I'm looking very much forward to hearing Dave's talk as well. As Brian pointed out, we're working on increasing our Friends of Konza Prairie membership. So I would just encourage you to tell people about what we do. Tell people about the experience that you've had at Konza Prairie, and let them know that there are ways that they can support us continuing to be an important part of this community. And with that, I'll keep this short.
Thank you, John. And I'm going to pass this over to Jeff. Jeff Watson, our program chair. You're muted, Jeff.
I'm mute.
There you go.
I'm glad to see everyone here. Again, I'll also add that I'm sorry we couldn't meet in person and share soup today, but maybe next time. So we hope everything will get better. It's my pleasure today to present Dave Kendall, who's going to be the speaker. Dave grew up on a family farm about 30 miles south and west of Konza Prairie, where his ancestors settled on Clark's Creek in the late 1850s. He graduated from Harrington High in 1970 and enrolled in K-State that fall. He was there 3 years before transferring to KU, where he earned his BA in Cultural Geography, and then an MA in Media Anthropology from KU also, and began producing documentaries in the early 1980s. In 1987, he joined KTWU Channel 11 in Topeka, with his primary assignment being to create a series of programs about Kansas. That series, called Sunflower Journeys, first hit the air in 1988 with Kendall serving as host. He continued in that role for 27 years, producing several documentaries and community affairs programs, as well as stories for Sunflower Journeys, before moving on to launch his own production company, Prairie Hollow Productions. The Flint Hills Discovery Center Foundation has served as a sponsoring organization for 3 feature-length documentaries he has produced since that time. The first, which premiered on the 20th anniversary of the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, tells a story of that creation of that preserve in Chase County. The second, entitled Prairie Women, features a collection of stories about women engaged in various occupations in the Flint Hills. Jill, the director of our education program here at Konza Prairie, was one of the women featured in that program. Recently, he finished production on The Road to Santa Fe, a 90-minute documentary exploring the history of the Santa Fe Trail in conjunction with its 200th anniversary. He'll be sharing some of the content of his documentaries with us today, and I hope you enjoy the program. And please let me welcome Dave Kendall. Dave, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. And thank you, Jill and John and Brian and Retta. It's good to see Retta again. Retta, the last time I was over to Konza Prairie for the wildflower walk with some friends of mine, Retta was our tour guide. So learned a lot on that and appreciated that. And I'm sorry we're not all back there together again today. That would definitely be preferable, but that's the way it is. And I'm glad we're not taking a health risk and exposing each other to those nasty COVID germs. So this is a good alternative. I'm here in my little prairie hideaway. It's a place we call Prairie Hollow. My wife and I were on a little 10-acre patch of prairie about 15 miles southwest of Topeka. And we're actually a registered agritourism site, although we don't advertise it, but we have a little hiking trail here that we invite people to come out and, stretch their legs and get out in nature a bit by appointment only, basically. So that's where I'm at. The scene behind me is one of the landmarks on the Santa Fe Trail. That's Point of Rock, which is in the Cimarron National Grasslands down by Elkhart, Kansas. And I am going to be talking about the Santa Fe Trail today, but before I get to that, there's some other stories that I've done related to prairies and the Konza Prairie that I thought might be of interest to you. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time showing some other short videos before I get to the Santa Fe Trail. And I have a request, unless it breaks the rules. If you wouldn't mind just turning on your cameras for a while and leaving them on as you feel comfortable. You can turn them on, turn them off. I think it would be nice to have some sense of interaction from my point of view, to see you guys that I'm talking to, rather than a list of black and white names on the screen in front of me. I know a lot of you, so it is kind of like my Friends of Konza Prairie, and so it's good to see you guys, and I appreciate you being here. I hope this is worth your while, and we'll leave some time yet this afternoon to get outside while the sun's still shining and it's not too cold, hopefully. So good to see you all. Yeah, as Jeff was saying, I grew up about 30 miles from Konza Prairie, and I went to K-State. So I made that drive. My commute to K-State was by Konza Prairie. It was up McDowell Creek Road. So I'm familiar with the landscape out there. And when I started at K-State, Konza Prairie as such didn't exist at that point in time. So we would go walking out at Hackberry Glen, and that was about the best access we could get at the time. But I really appreciate having the prairie out there now, and having the public access, I think, is really a bonus. My first outing actually to Konza Prairie as such was for during the first season of Sunflower Journeys, which actually premiered in January of 1988. And one of the first stories that I produced was about Konza Prairie, which seemed, a good Kansas thing to do, to focus on the prairie. So that was I think it was maybe in the second program ever of the Sunflower Journey series, back in January of 1988. So I actually have access to the vault of videos. So I went back through and I looked up the video that I produced about Konza Prairie. And so that's what I'm going to start with today. And if we can do the share screen function, we'll see how well that works for me. Oh, good, it's there. I can access it, it looks like. So this first one, some of you recognize the three gentlemen I interviewed. Ted Barkley, Elmer Fink, and Joe Gelroth were all interviewed for this piece. It's about a little over 9 minutes long. So I'm going to share the screen, and hopefully everything comes together. Yes.
Joe Gelroth is with us today.
Joe is here?
Yeah.
Oh, well, hello, Joe. Good to see you again, kind of. All right. Well, see if he has anything to say about what he said way back then. All right, so here we go. Kansas was once covered by a blanket of tall grass. It stretched as far as the eye could see. About all that's left of that tall grass prairie can be found in places like the Flint Hills, where the soil is too rocky and the slopes are too steep for cultivation. It's here that the Nature Conservancy has acquired a large block of land to preserve a part of the prairie and to help us understand how it functions. Driving along Interstate 70 south of Manhattan, travelers often take note of this sign, but few people can say just what it is that goes on here.
1971, we had the first part of it organized, which is down south of us here by the interstate. In 1977, we acquired what's called the Dewey Ranch, and the Dewey Ranch was a cattle ranch put together by the Dewey family out of Chicago before the turn of the century, and then there were several owners until we acquired it in '77. Altogether, that's about 8,600 acres, a little less than 9,000 acres.
Ted Barkley is professor of biology at Kansas State University and the person in charge of this piece of prairie owned by the Nature Conservancy.
Konza Prairie Research Natural Area was founded in 1971 with additions again in 1977 and a little later. It was acquired through the efforts of the late Dr. Lloyd C. Hulbert, who was professor of botany, plant ecology here at Kansas State from 1955 until his death a year and a half or so ago. Dr. Hulbert was concerned with the fact that we knew relatively little about tallgrass prairie and the dynamics of a grassland ecosystem. So he spent many years and much hard labor developing a program for research that would help us to answer some basic questions about how the prairie works. Through his efforts and his combined work with the Nature Conservancy, an organization out of Virginia that's interested in preserving natural habitats in North America, the money was raised to purchase the land that is now Konza Prairie Research Natural Area. The land is owned by the Nature Conservancy and is leased to Kansas State University and the Division of Biology for long-term research here. And it's one of many of the Nature Conservancy areas. But in some of the other Nature Conservancy areas, the main emphasis is preservation. In ours, it's preservation, but research is our main emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
Sure that they
Elmer
don't,
Fink coordinates the research projects carried out at Konza Prairie. How many different researchers are involved right now?
Typically we have between 30 to 45 or 50. And that includes all the people from those who are postdocs to people who have their PhD and our faculty members here, and the students, undergraduate students and graduate students. We have over 150 this year, and the reason for that is because of the NASA project.
The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, has been conducting one of the more elaborate studies here.
But all those individuals aren't working on the ground. Some of them are actually doing flights over the area and satellite pictures and things such as that they're working with.
So the NASA research is multi-layered.
Yes, it is. It goes all the way from sampling on the ground. You actually do clipping on the ground through weather balloons up through the satellites. So what they're doing is trying to coordinate climatic conditions, weather conditions, from the ground all the way up through the satellite.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What are some of the other type of programs or research projects?
There are people that are studying the streams, the organisms that are in the streams, and we have individuals that are studying above ground insects, below ground insects, individuals studying birds and small mammals, people studying plants, and then there are some that are working on the individual basis. That is, they're working with individual species, and others who are working on a whole big watershed basis. So they're comparing Konza to another larger area, for example. Our biggest research area is burning and what effect that has. That really is the major part of the management of the site. Almost every square inch of prairie out here has got some kind of a burn program on it.
In the position of site manager, Joe Gelroth supervises the maintenance of Konza Prairie, which includes a program of controlled burning.
We know that fire is an integral part of the tallgrass prairie, and so we do use fire as a management tool and then as a research aid. So every spring, portions of the prairie are burned, and in the research scheme of things, we burn some areas every year. And then we compare those areas with areas that are burned on a less frequent scale. Say, some of them are burned every other year, and some of them every 4 years. And we've got some areas that are burned every 10 years. And we're able to make a comparison of the effect of the fire on the ecosystem functioning. Specifically, one of the things that's very, very obvious after you burn is that the following fall, the big blue stem, which is the major dominant grass, has flowered. And there's a lot of seed sources out there. But the fires do just more than that. We know generally what happens when you don't burn. You lose the prairie. It gets invaded by brush and trees, and soon you don't have a prairie anymore. The major role here is the preservation of the ecosystem. We want to make sure that 100 years from now we still have a prairie.
At the time we stopped by the Konza Prairie in the fall of '87, they are getting ready to receive some new residents, a herd of buffalo.
We'll be getting a herd of approximately 30 animals, cows and their calves, from Fort Riley. And then we will also bring some individuals either from Maxwell Game Preserve here in Kansas or from some of the Nature Conservancy's land in Nebraska or South Dakota, and we'll bring in a couple of bulls. And the reason that we're doing that is we want to increase the genetic diversity. We don't want to have the bulls and the cows from one herd here. We want to increase that diversity, so we will bring in bulls from an outside herd.
What sorts of things have you had to do to prepare for bringing those in?
We had to construct a fence, and it's a 12-stranded, 8-foot high fence, and it's an electric fence with posts about 40 feet apart. That fence is now fully operational. It's a fence that was developed in Australia for keeping kangaroos and such in. We have developed this fence not only for the bison, which we'll be adding this year, but also for the pronghorn and the elk, which will be added in subsequent years. So we've had to design the fence to keep in elk, which are high jumpers, and antelope, which will crawl under a fence, and then the bison, which will generally run through a fence. So we have to have it flexible but strong.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have taken the time to inform our researchers some of the problems that they're going to be dealing with, because this is a wild animal and it will have its natural instincts. So they will be watching the bison and watching their behaviors and making sure that they don't get themselves, for example, between a cow and its calf.
Mm-hmm. Is there any other research facility like this around a prairie?
There is not any like this that is in a prairie. We are the only one in the United States. There are areas similar to this in other kinds of ecosystems, but this one, this tall grass prairie, this is the only one that exists.
Because of the research and preservation efforts being carried out here, entrance is restricted. However, there is a hiking trail on the north edge of the prairie, and group tours can be arranged through the Division of Biology at K-State.
Okay, I'm going to spare you the end of that. I got a little carried away and a little schmaltzy with the end of it, and it was music and slow motion video at the end, and it kind of goes on and on too long now. But anyhow, so Jill, did you notice there was an orange calf there?
I did
What
notice that. Yeah.
Somebody wrote a book about orange cows and the significance. Yeah. And I wonder if Joe has any comments about that piece. I suppose there have been a few changes around the prairie since those days, eh?
Yeah, there's been a few changes, but I think the focus is still the same. We want to make
Yep.
sure that 100 years from now, we still have a prairie. There's still
Right.
an active burn program, and the bison herd is now up to close to 300 animals.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
It really is.
Well, I appreciate the research that goes on about burning. I mean, that's really an important part of the puzzle there, and it helps folks maintain their own prairies. Like I've got a little prairie that I have to burn, and it's something that I think is really important to know how to go about it best. So anyhow, that was back then. I did get back out to the prairie a couple more times during my Sunflower Journeys years. We did a story out there with Jim Chereau, the environmental historian at K-State, at one point, and we came out and he brought some students out on a field trip and did the hiking trail. And that was back in '96, I guess. And then I came out there and did an interview with Chuck Rice from K-State at one point in time, about 2008, when we were talking about climate change. And he talked about the role of prairies in regard to climate change, which I won't go into here, but you probably know that that is a significant factor. So I've been out there and I enjoy getting out and hiking the trail whenever I get a chance. So after I left KTWU, after 27 years, I decided I'd leave when I was young enough to still do my own thing for a few more years. So I left about 6 years ago and formed my own production company called Prairie Hollow Productions. And I've done some documentaries, some long form documentaries since then. And as I was thinking about what to do the first one on, I thought about the tallgrass prairie and the fact that there hadn't been a whole lot done on it at that point in time. And I found out that there was an anniversary coming up of the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve down in Chase County. So I thought, well, maybe that would make an interesting story. So that's what we focused on in the first documentary, the the creation of the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve and what was involved with that. They started working on it in the, I don't know, at least the 70s, probably back into the 60s. And there were various professors related to K-State and such, various grassroots organizations that lobbied for it. And at one point of time, they had a proposal to create a national park up east of Tuttle Creek Reservoir. And didn't go over too well with some of the locals. So that kind of complicated things for a while. But in 1996, they finally got around to approving it, the concept. And so I did this documentary in 2016. It came out on the 20th anniversary of the Tallgrass Preserve. And so this next one is just, if you haven't seen that program, it'll give you a sense of where we went with that documentary.
These 5 million acres of native grass in the Flint Hills and the southern tip of the Flint Hills, which are called the Osage Hills by the Oklahomans. That's the last large, significant expanse of tallgrass prairie in the whole world.
When we're right here at the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, we're kind of in the midst of all that there is of the tallgrass prairie functionally. I mean, yeah, there are big chunks of it. There's 1,000 acres here and there in Iowa and Missouri, but when you talk about its full ecological expression, the grandeur and glory of the tallgrass prairie that the Native Americans revered, that made ranchers able to survive here, this is it.
Anyone that visits me from out of state, this is on the list of places to come. I mean, where else can you go see and get public access to this sort of expanse, where you can go spend some time with bison? You can't get that anywhere else.
So I'm like, wow, here in the middle of the continent, in the middle of Kansas, you can have a connection with our planet.
It's the sky dome that goes back and over your head. It's that whole feeling of this is all around me, you know.
And the people that were here, the Native Americans, that is a great history. And I think for a place that provides people a chance to go and walk out there and think about the history of those people. And the most amazing stories are right there.
It's the history of what we were and are and will be. And it's important to preserve. And I think a state that can do that is only adding to the richness of the next generation of inheritance.
It's been called an important document of how people with strongly opposing viewpoints can listen to each other and finally achieve together a lasting good. So much beautiful content and great explanation of a complex and remarkable story. It's the story of the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, a true love story from the Flint Hills of Kansas.
So there we go. We had that, as I said, we premiered that in November of 2016 at the Granada Theater in Emporia. And it was really a great turnout. A lot of people came, people from the Park Service and various ranchers and such came. And it was a great experience there. And then we had another screening at the Wareham Theater in Manhattan. And we had another good turnout. Nancy Castlebaum came to that screening. She's a real sweetheart, one of my favorite Kansans. And that whole event, the creation of that prairie, would likely not have happened without her involvement. I don't think it probably would have happened today, the creation of a preserve like that. It was a political situation, and she helped bring parties from different political perspectives together to, work it out. And I think we really owe her a debt of gratitude for actually getting it created, because it seems to be a pretty popular place now that people can go and get out on the trails there. So that's an interesting story. Again, it's a long story. It's 90 minutes of it. And we actually do see Konza Prairie in that program. There's a part in it talking about the efforts to publicize the role of the tallgrass prairie. And there was a woman by the name of Patricia Duncan, who was a photographer that created a Smithsonian exhibit about the tallgrass prairie, and it had national exposure. And so in her efforts to publicize the prairie, she actually helped tour Gordon Parks, the photographer around Konza Prairie. And so we talked about that, you know, what impact that had. It had quite an impact on Gordon Parks, apparently, coming out to Konza Prairie. And so that's another part of that story. After we did the Tallgrass Prairie documentary, which we wouldn't have been able to do without the support of the Flint Hills Discovery Center. The foundation associated with the Discovery Center has served as our sponsoring organization for these projects, and it's really key. We need a sponsoring organization to serve as a fiscal agent and to serve as kind of the umbrella organization when it comes time to apply for grants and that sort of thing. And so the Tallgrass Preserve was the first project, and that seemed to go pretty well. And so we went back to them with the idea of doing another one related to the Flint Hills. And that's something I came up with the idea of focusing on women in the Flint Hills, because when we did the story on the Tallgrass Preserve, I realized that women had a major role to play in establishing the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve as I learned more about the history. And so I thought, well, maybe we'll just do a show about women in the Flint Hills. And so engaging women in the Flint Hills. So we had people, we got funding to do that again, and got started. And we had people like Jane Koger, who is a rancher down around Matfield Green, and you probably have heard of her. She's got a large acreage down there, and has won a lot of awards for her grass management. So that was Jane started the ball rolling on that program, and the Hoy family came into the picture. And then there was somebody that we ran into at a place called the Ad Astra Cafe in Strong City. And this woman just kind of piped up as my wife and I were sitting there having supper. And that's when I met Jill. And she was very friendly, and we got to know her. And so as I was coming up with ideas of who we might have in our engaging women of the Flint Hills, I thought, well, there's this education coordinator at the Konza Prairie. I bet she might be a good person to profile as well. So as you know, if you've seen the Prairie Women documentary, Jill's one of the people we feature. So I've got a little clip. In addition to doing the documentaries, and there's like a 9-minute segment on all these women in the documentary. But as we work on these, I also put together shorter pieces that I can put on Facebook so that people can see what we're doing as we go along in production. And so I put up like a 3-minute video with Jill giving us a tour up towards the bison. So I'm going to roll that one next. And if I can get the shared screen to come back up, here we go. Little tour of the bison loop with Jill.
I'm from eastern half of South Dakota, which is historically tallgrass prairie, and how interesting it is that I didn't really discover the tallgrass prairie until after I came back to Kansas. And the lady that provided the funds to purchase this, her name is Catherine Ordway, and she was the heir to the 3M fortune out of Minnesota. She donated the money to the Nature Conservancy, but not just to buy this place, but she also bought other prairie areas in the United States. And one of the places that she bought was in South Dakota, and I actually remember going there, and that was actually my first experience of walking on a true tallgrass prairie, was actually at the Ordway Prairie. And so how interesting is it to come back around to Konza Prairie that was funded by the Ordway family.
I've told somebody, and I truly believe it, that I have the world's best job because there's no typical day and everything is going to be dependent on the weather and on who walks in the door or who drives up the driveway. It is something new and something different every day, and that's one of the really great things. And getting to work out here is really a privilege. So my audience is multiple. The primary audience are kids. You know, the K through 12 school groups are the primary audience, and we want to bring them out here to the site to experience their prairie, their ecosystem. And when they come out here, we don't just sit in a classroom and talk about it. We get them out into it, and so they are feeling it. They are smelling it. They are tasting it. They are experiencing it as much as they can possibly experience it. So there's a calf out there. There's a calf out there, and the calf is way down here. Do you see the calf laying down right next to its mama? And so when the calf was born, it was orange. All bison babies are orange when they're born. And after about 6 weeks, they lose their baby orange coat and they get their brown coat. Why would they lose that baby orange coat and get a thick, heavy brown coat?
It's getting bigger.
It's getting bigger. Why would they want a thick, heavy brown coat?
Because winter?
Because winter is coming. People who don't know the tallgrass prairie are missing out on something very, very special, because the tallgrass prairie has a story to tell you that you need to pay attention to see what's happening, whether it's the flowers changing or the clouds building and dissipating, the turkeys coming in or the turkeys leaving, or the grasshoppers or the monarch butterflies. There's always a story to tell, and it's worth paying attention to.
Join us on our next adventure into the Flint Hills. Meet women who are truly at home on the range. Some of the engaging women of the Flint Hills.
I've never
We have
seen
to say
that
for
before.
yourself. You haven't seen that one before?
I've never seen that before. And I need
Oh,
to tell, I need to tell John Blair that I wasn't driving as fast as it made it look like I was driving. Like, it looked like I was speeding. I was not driving that fast, John.
What is the speed limit out there, huh?
Slow.
Slow. Yes. It was a GoPro camera. It kind of changes the perspective on things. And so, yeah. But you got us up the hill safely. And
I did.
so,
I did.
yes,
That was really sweet. Thank you, Dave.
yes. And thank you for taking part in that project. Again, that project was well received. We premiered it at the Emporia Granada Theater as well as at the Wareham Theater in Manhattan. So we had a good response to that as well. So anyhow, getting to know Jill though, so the next project that came along, she also had a little role to play in, and you're going to see that here next. And this is where we start talking about the Santa Fe Trail. And how I got involved in this project, it's after I finished those first two documentaries, it's kind of like, okay, what are we going to do next? What would be of interest to people? What might I be able to get funded? Because I don't have the KTW paying my salary anymore, so you have to raise funds to do these. And so I thought, I heard about the bicentennial of the Santa Fe Trail coming along, and I thought, well, there's something that might have some interest in and might be able to fund. And I heard about it in a couple different ways. One was through Symphony in the Flint Hills, because the year of the bicentennial, the Symphony was focusing on the Santa Fe Trail as his main theme this past summer. And I've had some connection with Symphony. I've been the MC there for a number of years. So I thought, well, that's getting kind of close to home there. Maybe that would be an interesting topic. And about that time, I heard my friend Rex Buchanan do a commentary on Kansas Public Radio about this new hiking trail they were building along the Santa Fe Trail east of Council Grove. And so it's kind of like, okay, there's another connection to the trail. I know Rex. And so anyhow, I looked around and I contacted the folks with the Santa Fe Trail Association, which is actually headquartered here in Kansas, out near Fort Larned. I asked them if anybody was doing anything about the Santa Fe Trail as a subject, as a documentary, and they didn't know of anything. So I looked and I couldn't find that much had been done on it, which is kind of surprising because it's a pretty significant piece of our history. You'd think there'd be something that had been done, but there really wasn't much. So we went about, getting funding to do the documentary on the trail. And again, the Flint Hills Discovery Center agreed to serve as our sponsoring organization. And so about 3 years ago, we got going on that, starting to do research and getting footage to go with it. And this first part, it's ended up, for some reason, 90 minutes seems to be the length of the documentaries that come to me, that they just work out. I can't do it in 60 minutes. I tried to do this one in 60 minutes based upon the request of a PBS program director. He said it's easier to put into a schedule if it's only 60 minutes. 90 minutes is kind of hard for the program directors to fit. So I thought, okay, that's a good point. But there was no way I could get it to 60. At one point, I was going to lobby for a 2-hour time slot because I had more than 90 actually, as it turned out. But I decided that I'd go with 90. So that's what this turned out to be. It's told in 8 parts, the history of the Santa Fe Trail. And basically it's pretty straightforward approach to the history. Turns out that another reason I was meant to do this documentary, I guess you could say, is because the guy that is currently one of the foremost authorities on the Santa Fe Trail is a guy by the name of Leo Oliva, who is a historian farmer who lives up north of Hays. He taught at Fort Hays State for a number of years, but he's written books about all the forts in Kansas, and he knows more about the Santa Fe Trail than most anybody I know. And Leo happened to be one of the people that was in my very first independently produced documentary back in 1983, when I did a documentary about the family farm in Kansas. So Leo helped with that one, and I hadn't really seen him much since then. So it was good to hook up with him again and use his expertise as we told the story of the Santa Fe Trail. So we started out, this first piece is kind of setting the stage for the trail and its development. And one of the things that, the first successful trading expedition to Santa Fe from Missouri, which was the western frontier at the time, took place in 1821. So that's why 2021 was the bicentennial of the trail. But there were things that happened, and there were people here before that point of time, as you might imagine. And so we get into a little bit of that as we tell a little bit of the prehistory of the trail in the first part of this program. And to do that, we asked Jim Chereau again to come out to the prairie with us. And Jill came along and helped us get set up on a hill out in the middle of Konza Prairie so we could see if we could get some bison grazing in the background of the interview, which we managed to do. And Jill even lent a hand doing a little work with the reflector to make his face look a little bit crisper in the interview. So this first part of the documentary will give you an idea of where we go and a little bit about how the Santa Fe Trail got started. So again, I will share a screen, and this one's a little bit long. It's about 14 minutes. And it starts out with a voice that you may be trying to place. Who is that guy? It's another prairie guy, actually. His name is Bill Curtis. You may recognize he's a veteran broadcaster. He also owns the Red Buffalo Ranch down in southeastern Kansas. And so he loves the Tallgrass Prairie too. And I asked him to do the voiceover for the opening title sequence. And he knocked it out in about 20 minutes and sent it back to me. So that's who that voice is to start with.
In the heart of North America, the gateway to the west rises above St. Louis and the Mississippi River. Not far north, the Missouri River flows into the Mississippi. Steamboats once plied these waters, carrying manufactured goods from the east and travelers heading west. Churning their way upstream on the Missouri, they deposited passengers and cargo at landings that spawned new cities. For some, the journey continued westward, following a prairie pathway into land where the Osage, Kaw, and the Pawnee had long roamed in pursuit of large game. Crossing through rolling hills of tall grass, they moved on west to find another river and follow it across the plains. Some then branched off to the southwest, crossing a landscape where water could be in short supply. Others continued on west, stopping by a privately owned trading post before heading up and over a rugged mountain pass. Both routes came together again near a remote army outpost, passing by the remnants of an ancient Pueblo village before descending through the last pass and arriving at their journey's end in Santa Fe.
Major funding for this program has been provided by Diane C. Shoemaker in support of programming that reflects a passion for our history as it propels us into a vision for the future. By Carl and Mary Ice. And by Ross M. Jory. Additional funding is provided by Humanities Kansas, a nonprofit cultural organization that connects communities with history, traditions, and ideas to strengthen civic life. By the Barton P. and Mary D. Cohen Charitable Trust, providing support for the betterment of our community. By Kansas Tourism, providing resources to help plan your Kansas adventure. Information available at travelks.com. By Richard Porter of Porter Cattle Company. And by Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area.
Unlike the immigrant trails to Oregon and California, the Santa Fe Trail involved the transport of trade goods and a commercial exchange of international extent. It started out in central Missouri, crossing through what was then Indian territory between the United States and Mexico, whose border extended much farther north than it does today. A quarter century later, the U.S. Army marched down the trail to confront Mexican forces, which resulted in a significant expansion of American territory. Commerce on the trail came to an end when the railroads built across the middle of the nation, providing a cheaper and easier mode of transport.
For 27 years, I served as the host of a series called Sunflower Journeys, broadcast by public television stations across Kansas and western Missouri. Early on in that series, I produced a short story about the Santa Fe Trail, which in 1987, Congress had designated a National Historic Trail.
In this program, we're taking a longer journey through time to explore the historical significance of the trail, reflecting upon the impact it had upon indigenous populations and the manner in which it brought people from a variety of cultures into closer contact with each other.
My grandfather's grandfather got a job wrangling mules to pull a freight wagon down the trail not long after he got off the steamboat at Independence, Missouri in 1857. Then he settled down to farm not far off the trail near Council Grove in the territory that would soon become the state of Kansas.
Well, Council Grove is probably one of the key points on the trail. Treaty was signed here with the Osage Indians in 1825 to open the trail so that the Indians gave permission to travelers to not bother them. And then because of the hardwood trees that were here for supplies for axle trees and so on, it became a rendezvous point. And soon after the trail was started, traders would come sort of separately to this point because they felt safe from Indians to this point. And then from this point on, they wanted to be, travel together, provide their own protection. But it was the rendezvous point on the trail for a long period of time.
A founding member of the Santa Fe Trail Association and one of the foremost authorities on the history of the trail, Leo Oliva came to Council Grove to deliver a public presentation about the trail. Although Council Grove is widely recognized as a significant rendezvous point on the Santa Fe Trail, the trail originated further east in Missouri. The first person to lead a successful trading expedition to Santa Fe, William Becknell, started out from the small town of Franklin.
Franklin was one of the earliest towns founded on the Missouri River in the center part of Missouri, and it was because of the Boone's Lick salt lick. The Boone family, the children of Daniel Boone, some of his sons, came out. There was a good salt lick near Franklin, and the town of Franklin was established there then in 1816. William Becknell came there first to work at that salt lick, and then he had a farm near Franklin. He got into debt. He was facing debtor's prison because that was common at that time to place people that couldn't pay their debts in prison. And he had heard rumors, as had others, that Mexico was in a war with Spain for their independence. And he also had heard rumors that when Mexico became independent, that trade would be welcomed in New Mexico. So Becknell and 5 others with pack horses, they set out in early September of 1821.
I like to think about that year 1821 because it was so significant.
The president of the Missouri Historical Society in St. Louis, Francis Levine, previously served as director of the New Mexico History Museum in Santa Fe.
And usually I don't think about a single year. I usually think about a span of time, but in regard to the Santa Fe Trail and to both the economies of St. Louis and Santa Fe, 1821 was significant. So in 1821, New Mexico won its independence from Spain, and that meant that all of the trade embargoes, all of the restrictions on trade with the United States were lifted. And for Missouri, of course, that was the year of statehood. So it's a year that was significant and that really knitted together these two ends of the country.
At the time William Becknell and his group headed out from Franklin, New Mexico was still governed by the Viceroyalty of New Spain. But their timing proved to be fortuitous as Mexico gained its independence from Spain before they arrived. They started out heading west along the north side of the Missouri River. In his journal, Becknell provided an account of their journey.
Our company crossed the Missouri near the Ararock Ferry on the first day of September 1821 and encamped 6 miles from the ferry. The next morning, being warm and cloudless, we proceeded on our journey over a beautiful rolling prairie country and traveled 33 miles. We suffered some inconvenience for 2 or 3 days on account of rains and a cool and humid atmosphere. Arrived at Fort Osage, we wrote letters, purchased some medicines, and arranged such affairs as we thought necessary previous to leaving the confines of civilization.
As they moved on west from Fort Osage, the last outpost on the Missouri, Becknell's party passed through the area now developed as metropolitan Kansas City, and then they entered Indian Territory, part of which later became the state of Kansas.
In 1821, that's about 40 years before statehood in Kansas, and it's before Kansas becomes a territory.
Jenny Chin serves as executive director of the Kansas Historical Society, which administers a number of historic sites along the Santa Fe Trail in addition to operating the Kansas Museum of History in Topeka. She notes that Becknell's was not the first trading party to pass through the area.
The Native Americans, the American Indians are trading with each other at all times. We have a lot of archaeological sites in this state that very clearly show how far trade items are coming in from other parts of the country, as well as do other parts of the country have trade items that had to have originated in Kansas.
You know, there are trade networks that archaeologists have documented since way before the Europeans. And I think when the Europeans came in, we know right from the beginning that in the journals of Coronado, in the journals of De Soto, they talk about native trade networks that were already going on.
So the idea that this is open space, which is often a myth about the West, is that it's all open space. It's not open space. It's being occupied by the people whose ancestral lands these are.
Archaeologists have pinpointed that perhaps people were around this area as far back as 10,000 years before now, maybe even earlier.
A history professor familiar with tribal cultures of the Great Plains, Jim Chereau has studied the habits of those who occupied Indian Territory at the time Becknell passed through, tribes such as the Osage, the Kaw, and the Pawnee.
Let's take a look at the Pawnees, because they're a good indicator of how the Great Plains were actually occupied. The Pawnee set earth lodge villages, usually located in river valleys. They were agricultural. They raised corn, squashes, beans, but they did this on a seasonal basis. So they would plant in the spring, and then everybody would go out into the grasslands to the west and do a bison hunt. And then they come back for the fall harvest, celebrate that, and then have a winter hunt, and then come back for the spring planting. So there were these what you might call fairly permanent villages, earth lodge villages, and then the more mobile hunting expeditions that occurred twice a year biennially.
Passing through Indian Territory, Becknell's group did not encounter any of the indigenous inhabitants as they traveled over the prairie.
It is a circumstance of surprise to us that we have not seen Indians or fresh signs of them, although we have traversed their most frequented hunting ground. But considering their furtive habits and their predatory disposition, the absence of their company during our journey will not be a matter of regret.
About 3 weeks after their journey began, they arrived at a wide, shallow river they followed on west toward the Rocky Mountains.
And they followed the Arkansas River into present Colorado. They went up partway on the Purgatory River. Then they crossed what's today called Emory Gap to get across the mountains into New Mexico. And then they were met by troops in New Mexico coming out of Santa Fe. Those troops escorted them back and welcomed them into Santa Fe.
The day after my arrival, I accepted an invitation to visit the governor, whom I found to be well informed and gentlemanly in manners. His demeanor was courteous and friendly. He asked many questions respecting my country and expressed a desire that the Americans would keep up an intercourse with that country.
Dispose of his trade goods at great profit. There was a great demand for cloth items in particular, and this included cottons, linens, whatever that was available. And they sold out, made all this money. They came back. They left New Mexico in January. They were back in Missouri in the spring, and he begins organizing another trip in 1822, and he decides that he thinks he can take wagons to New Mexico.
So what happens next? He made it back after a successful trading expedition. He came back, and the legend has it, when he got back to Franklin, Missouri, he had a leather pouch full of coins, and he ripped it open so the coins could fall onto the street and people could be impressed at how much money he had brought back from his trading expedition. I don't know that that's true. I don't suppose they had paved streets in Franklin, Missouri at that time, so it probably wouldn't have made much noise to dump them on the dirt. But anyhow, that's how it got started. 1821 was a significant year. Anybody that had tried sooner than that had been arrested by Spanish authorities because they didn't want to have anything to do with American traders. There had been people that tried and they ended up in prison. But he managed to time it just right and get there when Mexico had won its independence, and they really wanted to start up a trade with America. So it was a different story. In 1822, he decided that he would try taking wagons back. So they were able to get back. I think there were only like 3 wagons full of goods that they took. So it wasn't a major train that they had going back, but they did prove that you could get wagons to Santa Fe. And then things started picking up steam from that. And before long, traders were putting pressure on Congress through their local senator in Missouri, a guy by the name of Thomas Hart Benton, who was the great uncle of the painter Thomas Hart Benton. He was a senator from Missouri, and they got legislation passed which authorized the government to actually chart the trail across. So they started out from Fort Osage, Missouri, which was the frontier at the time. And Fort Osage now is kind of where Independence, Missouri is, a little bit east of Independence, Missouri now. But that's where they started from, and they started marking the trail toward Santa Fe. And that was in 1825. And when they got to Council Grove, which really was only a crossing point on the trail at that time, Council Grove as such didn't exist. But by the time they had their treaty with the Osage Indians there, Council Grove, the name was carved into a tree there. And so that was how Council Grove really got started in connection to the Santa Fe Trail in 1825. So the treaty was with the Osage Indians, and then they did another treaty a few weeks later with the Kansa Indians, the Kaw, who were out on a buffalo hunt in what's now McPherson County. So they didn't mess with any of the other tribes. They figured, well, they can't get them all. So they figured 2 was good enough, I guess, to get permission to have safe passage across the native lands. But that's when, you know, things then, it was official, the government had sanctioned this, and things were off and running. So by the latter part of the 1820s, more Mexican merchants became involved in it, and it really became more of a 2-way thoroughfare where there were goods going back and forth, and Mexican merchants had some money to put into it too. And so they really stimulated the trade. And there would be, you know, manufactured goods coming from the east end towards Santa Fe, and from the west end, there would be raw materials, wool and beaver pelts and hides and that sort of thing, as well as things like mules, which I didn't realize. I always thought mules came out of Missouri, but Missouri got their mules from New Mexico. So the mules were brought back up the Santa Fe Trail, and then they became a significant part of the transport on the trail. But a common thing that people think of the Santa Fe Trail, and they assume that it was kind of like the Oregon Trail, that there were settlers that went out and, you know, settle out that part of the country. And that really wasn't what the Santa Fe Trail was about. It was a trail of commerce. But it really did open up this part of the country to commerce and later expansion. So anyhow, that program, the 90-minute program, is being distributed to PBS stations across the nation now. And it just aired in Santa Fe in New Mexico last Sunday night. So I was glad to see that. It's up to each PBS station to decide whether or not they'd pick up a program like this. And I was glad to see New Mexico. Thought it might be worth airing to their folks. So it did make it to Santa Fe, actually, Sunday night. And Monday night, it aired here again in Topeka on KTWU. So it has aired locally. It's been on the PBS station in Kansas City a number of times, and probably will get a few more airings in the future. We also have it online, streaming online. So if this, you know, you think this would be interesting, you can find it and watch it online, or on DVD, which we created a DVD. And the DVD, as I said, I wanted to make it a 2-hour program, and and it ended up cutting out a half hour, really good content. So I put the extra half hour on the DVD. So there's more stories related to the history of the Santa Fe Trail on the DVD, as well as some what I call classroom videos. There's not a whole lot of material out there for teachers to use in their classrooms that I know of. And I'm thinking primarily of elementary and junior high classrooms. So within the documentary, we did some profiles of some of the historical characters associated with the trail. You heard one of them there, and that was the voice of Daryl Brogdon from Kansas Public Radio, narrating the words of William Becknell, the first trader. And there were some other people from Kansas Public Radio that lent their voices to some of the other characters that we brought into this. And the next one you're going to hear is the voice of Jay Schaefer, reading from a book called Commerce of the Prairies. And Commerce of the Prairies was a book that came out in 1844 that was really influential and informing people and stimulating even more interest in the Santa Fe trade. And it was written by a young man by the name of Josiah Gregg, another person that actually he was born in Franklin, Missouri, the same place that Becknell left on his first trading expedition. So Josiah Gregg is another historical character, and he wrote this book. And in this next piece, which is one of the short pieces, that it's only about 5 minutes long, 4.5, that we put on as a classroom video. It gives you a little taste of Josiah Gregg's take on the Santa Fe Trail. And he wrote of his experience going down the trail in 1831. So it's now we're like 10 years into the commerce of the trail is what we're moving on to now, 10 years after Becknell made his first trip down the trail. He grew up around the same community as William Becknell and later moved to Independence before heading out on the trail himself.
For some months preceding the year 1831, my health had been gradually declining. My physicians advised me to take a trip across the prairies. I accepted their suggestion and, without hesitation, proceeded at once to make the necessary preparations for joining one of those spring caravans which were annually starting from the United States for Santa Fe. At the conclusion of the season, which followed my first trip, I became interested as a proprietor in the Santa Fe trade and continued to be so for the 8 succeeding years. I crossed the prairies 8 different times, and with the exception of the time thus spent in traveling to and fro, the greater part of the 9 years of which I speak were passed in northern Mexico.
Josiah Gregg's journal, Commerce of the Prairies, is one of the most famous journals of the Santa Fe Trail era. And he published that in 1844, and he has a little story about St. Louis. In fact, he dismisses St. Louis as the beginning of the trail. Says St. Louis is not important, not as much as Independence.
People who reside at a distance have generally considered St. Louis as the emporium of the Santa Fe trade, but that city, in truth, has never been a place of rendezvous. The town of Franklin on the Missouri River, about 150 miles further to the westward, seems truly to have been the cradle of our trade. But as the navigation of the Missouri River had considerably advanced by the year 1831, the new town of Independence soon began to take the lead as a place of debarkation, outfit, and departure. Here they purchased their provisions for the road and many of their mules, oxen, and even some of their wagons, and make their final preparations for a long journey across the prairie wilderness.
You know, they would come in here and buy their wagons, buy their teams of yoke of oxen. They got their supplies here, and they loaded up their wagons here and headed west to Santa Fe.
It was on the 15th of May, 1831, that our little party set out from Independence. The general rendezvous at Council Grove was our immediate destination. It is usual for the traders to travel thus far in detached parties and to assemble there for the purpose of entering into some kind of organization for mutual security and defense during the remainder of the journey.
Council Grove had the last stand of hardwood timber between here and Santa Fe. It was a preeminent rendezvous point for many years. This was about as far west as you could go safely by yourself or in a small group. And so you'd wait here until you got 50 or 60 wagons to go with you and have some safety in numbers. They'd elect their officers and so forth, establish the order of travel and that sort of thing. And that's how they would move on from Council Grove.
Owing to the delays of organizing and other preparations, we did not leave the Council Grove camp till May 27th. Although the usual hour of starting with the prairie caravans is after an early breakfast, yet on this occasion we were hindered till the afternoon. "All's set" is finally heard from some teamster. "All's set" is directly responded from every quarter. "Stretch out," immediately vociferates the captain. Then the hips of drivers, the cracking of whips, the trampling of feet, the occasional creak of wheels, the rumbling of wagons form a new scene of exquisite confusion. "Fall in" is heard from headquarters, and the wagons are forthwith strung out upon the long inclined plain, which stretches to the heights beyond Council Grove.
So, did you realize that doctors used to prescribe a trip across the prairie for people that weren't feeling up to snuff? That was considered to be something that was very beneficial to their health. And that was, Josiah Gregg wasn't the only one that did that, made the trip across the prairies because he was feeling like he needed it to improve his health. As you see, Council Grove is one of those places that really is a historic site on the trail, and is within easy driving distance of the Konza Prairie. So you've probably been down there and checked things out. They have plans to continue the bicentennial observations of the Santa Fe Trail over the next few years, up to 2025, which will be the bicentennial of the treaty that was signed in Council Grove. And so they'll have some more special events that you can get in on as the time goes on. The Santa Fe Trail Association is promoting those. So that's an organization that you can consult if you're interested in seeing what's happening. The organization has local chapters all along the trail. So there's the Flint Hills chapter is basically headquartered in Council Grove. So if you have any interest in connecting with the Santa Fe Trail Association, they just had a meeting here recently to reorganize and get geared up for the excitement that's heading their way for the rest of the bicentennial. So Council Grove has all kinds of history connected to the trail. There's also another active chapter farther east on the trail near Baldwin City, and that's the Douglas County chapter of the Santa Fe Trail Association. So people ask, well, where can you go to kind of hook into the trail and get out and see things like trail ruts? And turns out that if you drive along Highway 56 to the east of Baldwin City, you'll come across a little roadside pull-off there. And there's a nature preserve in there, about 18 acres. It was originally the Ivan Boyd Memorial Prairie located there. And there's some really great trail ruts. And they've got funding to create this hiking trail, a walking trail around these ruts so you can get easy access to them now. So that's one place you can go, not too far away, to actually get out and get a sense of what the trail was like as it came down over the ridge through the prairie. So this is another short video that I did for Facebook, and it's on the DVD. And again, it's Rex Buchanan walking through the tall grass with Roger Boyd, who is actually in charge of managing that prairie there, and did a lot of the work in getting the funding to do the trail.
Just about anybody associated with the Santa Fe Trail will recognize the name Blackjack Ruts. The town of Blackjack was about a half mile to the east. So Main Street of the town of Blackjack was Santa Fe Trail, and it was on the south end, lined up with the south end of this prairie. So as they came across to the west, they headed down this ridge, probably because this was the best place to cross this creek.
You know, one of the things that people struggle with, and you hear this all the time, is when you talk about ruts, I know most people have in their mind's eye a two-track road, okay? Just single file two-track road. Then you bring them here and they scratch their heads like, well, this isn't what I was expecting to see at all. These are pretty spectacular.
Yeah, if you come out here after we burned it, the ruts are so much more visible, or even when they have 4 or 5 inches of vegetation on it.
Yeah.
So it's not just black. But yeah, they are so much clearer then.
So talk about the work you're doing here in terms of the trails and stuff.
Well, as we can see here, you're just kind of striking off on your own.
Bushwhacking.
And most people don't really come out here for a hike.
Sure.
And so they don't really appreciate trying to find their way through this grass. So one of the things that we're doing, we're planning on putting in a trail that is reasonably level over to the first rut, have some signage that will be protected from fire, that will talk about the site, both from the standpoint of Santa Fe Trail, but also the native prairie, because it is very impressive. And then from there, we will have a smaller trail. The ADA trail will be 5 foot wide, compacted, small gravel. This trail will be about 3 foot wide, compacted earth. And the plan will be that it'll be minimum maintenance, be built so that we won't have to maintain it that much. And it'll be much more receptive for people walking out here without the fear of snakes jumping out of the grass and grabbing them. But the plan is it'll come through these 3 main ruts. It'll come to the 4th rut up the hill. It'll more or less parallel it to the end of the ruts. And the south half of this 18 acres was actually plowed at one time. So there are no ruts down there.
So it's true today that this is probably as good a place on public property in Kansas. Come and see Santa Fe Trail wagon ruts, right?
Yes.
But it'll be even more true when you guys get done and have your trail system in, and that's going to be done when, do you think?
Well, we're planning on having a dedication June of 2021, so it'll coincide with the bicentennial.
So the ruts are still there. Now it has a walking trail around it, so it's kind of like the trail you have for the public access, where it's covered with basically buckshot, so it's easy walking, and it's worth a trip if you're into taking a look at that sort of thing. And I'm going on to over an hour now in my presentation, so I probably don't want to keep droning on here. Jill, we talked about maybe opening up to questions towards the end, and would this be a good time to see if anybody has any questions?
I think it's a wonderful time to see if anyone has any questions. And I'm going to start because I have one, and I don't know if you saw it in the chat. I said, what's next for Prairie Hollow Productions? Because I have an idea.
Well, let me hear your idea.
You talk about your family, and you're 5th, 6th generation?
Fifth generation.
Fifth generation.
I'm an old geezer.
Well, there's really, there's not that many of families that have been around for that long in the state of Kansas. And I know Mark Fighton, a professional photographer, he's also one. And I think that would be fascinating to hear about those families that have been here for that long and to find out what brought them here and how those families progressed. That's my idea.
Well, that's not a bad idea. I mean, this was an interesting project for me to think about my own family roots. I never really thought about it growing up. You know, it was just the farm where I lived and grew up, and I didn't think a whole lot about how we got there as a family. So it was interesting to find out more about, you know, wait a second, the first ancestor basically showed up by steamboat in Independence, Missouri, and his first job was wrangling mules or whatever on the Santa Fe Trail. And somebody referred to him as captain, and I don't know if that's true or not, or if that they were just joking, but they indicated he was a captain at one point on a wagon train to Santa Fe. Whether or not he was captain, he did make, I think, at least one trip to Santa Fe. In the process, he passed through Morris County, and he liked the look of the land there, and so that's when the land was still available, and so that's how we ended up settling in on that land to the north and west of Council Grove on Clarks Creek. And I was the last generation of our family that was in position to take over as a farmer as my dad retired. And it was kind of hard to walk away from that and see the family tradition as a farm family come to an end. But I just really wasn't a farmer. And my dad didn't think at that time in the late 70s that the situation was looking too good for the farming operation to continue anyhow. So I moved on to college and he retired, and we've since then sold the land. But the good thing is that my sister and her husband bought the core of it along the creek, and it's now a wildlife sanctuary along Clarks Creek, and they have it open. There's a little hiking trail there that the public can access. But again, thinking about my family history and how they got here, I really appreciated the opportunity with this Santa Fe Trail story, which there's a lot to it. And I didn't realize how interesting it would be when I got into it and how significant it was for the settlement of this part of the country and the resettlement of native tribes to Oklahoma, basically, which is something we get into in the documentary too, specifically related to the Kaw tribe, which, you know, used to be located, they had their big Blue Earth village in Manhattan for many years until things started getting rearranged and they got pushed onto smaller and smaller reservations and ended up down by Council Grove, which is a big part of the story. So we talk about that. We dedicate a whole chapter of the documentary to the Kaw tribe and the impact the trail had on them. So it wasn't just impact of the farm families and such that came in via the trail, but also the impact it had on Native American tribes that basically had to move on. But I appreciate your idea about another one looking at the past. I will keep that in mind.
Any other?
So how do we want to do the questions? Have people raise their hand?
They can just turn their audio on and ask.
Dave, I really appreciate your videos. Are they available, do you know, on the passport system that PBS has?
Actually, I'm not doing it through PBS. We have our own online streaming through Vimeo is a streaming service that we use. So you can connect to that through our website, prairiehollow.net.
Okay.
And,
how about your Sunflower Journal? Do they keep running those on Passport, or do you have to wait for them just to air them periodically?
I think they're available. Most of them, the last number of seasons are available on their I don't know if it's, I'm pretty sure it's through their Passport too. They also have if you go to sunflowerjourneys.org, they have some videos online that you can access that way, the last number of seasons.
Okay, thanks.
And then they still are running reruns of Sunflower Journeys, but as I understand it, it no longer is a functioning in production operation. That the series has come to an end after 33 years, I think it was.
Okay.
Anybody
Dave, hi,
else?
this is Sue Mays, and
hey Sue.
Generous offer of you to tell us about your sister's Clark Creek hiking trail. Does she really want us to know about it?
Well, they are happy for people to come down. They've opened it up. They haven't made a big deal about publicizing it, but it is part of the wildlife preserve system now of Audubon of Kansas. My brother-in-law, Gary Hayden, who lives in Manhattan, is the current president of the board of Audubon. And so, you know, they're promoting that sort of preservation and when possible for landowners to provide access to the land. And so I think they're trying to set an example. And as long as somebody doesn't go down there and leave trash bags and garbage along the trail, I think they're happy that people can come down and walk. He's built some stairs. There are some places that are a little bit steep, and he's built some impressive stairs along the creek to make it accessible, and one bridge that he even constructed.
Well, I capsized a canoe in that creek. It may still be somewhere in the bottom of it.
It's not a real deep creek right there.
Well, it was then. It was in flood stage, and we shouldn't have been on it.
Yeah. No, if anybody really wants to go, it's down between Harrington and Latimer on Highway 4. Clark's Creek crosses Highway 4 there. So it's a little place that you can go and take a hike. A little bit more about the history of the trail. I'll tell you briefly in case you're wondering what happened next after 1831 is kind of where we left that off. In the 1840s, 25 years after the first trading expedition went down with William Becknell, 25 years later, then the Army of the West headed down the Santa Fe Trail. And they had something different in mind. They weren't interested in trading so much as they were in kind of looking at maybe expanding American territory. So in 1846, what they call the Army of the West marched from Fort Leavenworth down the trail. And there were two forks of the trail. It forked out around just to the west of Dodge City. And then there was the Cimarron route, which went to the southwest across Cimarron grasslands and in that direction, straight to the southwest pretty much. But that was a dry route, and you really were risking running out of water for yourself and your livestock going that way. So there was another option, and that was going on into Colorado along the Ark River. And as you got into farther out there, there's a place called Bent's Fort, which was a privately owned trading post in Colorado. And that had been established by the Bent brothers and it had been one of these places where it was, you know, all kinds of people coming together, including Native American tribes, to trade at that place. But when the Army of the West was heading west, they stopped at Bent's Fort on their way towards Santa Fe in 1846. And Leo Oliva tells the story about there was somebody that was sent ahead, and they had kind of a surreptitious meeting with the governor in Santa Fe to kind of clear the way so that when American troops rode into Santa Fe, there wasn't any resistance from the Mexican forces. So there was some little negotiation and maybe some money changed hands, who knows what happened. But that's when Santa Fe actually first came under the American flag was in 1846 when the American troops rode in and raised the flag, which I guess I overlooked that in history class. I don't know. There was a lot of gaps in my knowledge of American history when it comes to this in regard to the Santa Fe Trail, but that was one of them. And the other was the fact that the Ark River was our border with Mexico for a number of years. That, you know, south of the Ark River, you were in Mexico up until the 1840s. So in like after the Army of the West marched to Santa Fe, they kept going on to California and joined with other forces. And 2 years later, Mexico is ceding all this territory that is, now the states of Arizona, California, and Utah, and Nevada. All that then came into United States territory. And so the Santa Fe Trail played a key role in helping open up, so to speak, or the westward expansion of the nation, to pull that part of our nation into it. So that was something that was a significant role that the Santa Fe Trail played in that process. And as time goes on into the 1850s, then forts are starting to be built along the trail. And that's kind of part of the pacification of the native tribes out there. And eventually that ended up in tribes being relocated into modern day Oklahoma, or Indian territory at the time. But that was another part of the history of the trail. And then into the 1850s, prior to the Civil War, there was a lot of violence along the trail, where you had, especially as Kansas was coming into the Union, the whole Bleeding Kansas period, where you had border ruffians from Missouri coming across and attacking the abolitionists under folks like John Brown. And so we get into the stories of conflict along the trail in eastern Kansas in the 1850s, related to that pre-Civil War period. So that's part of the story too, what happened along the trail at that period of time. And then into the 1860s, when the Civil War actually started, there was a decisive battle fought out by in New Mexico on Glorieta Pass. Was a place, it's southeast of Santa Fe, by Pecos National Preserve. Now it was Pecos Pueblo. And it was kind of the deciding battle between Union and Confederate forces. And if the Confederates had won that battle, there was a good chance they would have been able to establish relations with Britain and France, and had some success in taking over the western part of the US, because it turned out their supply train got destroyed and they were routed, and the Union forces came out victorious. And so basically that sealed the fate of the Confederacy in the western part of the US during the Civil War. So the Santa Fe Trail was key right there in the Civil War, even, and in that conflict, which is another part of history that I didn't realize. And then up into the 1870s, and that's when the railroad started pushing across from Kansas City to the west. And then that's when, they would reach Junction City, and then on to Ellsworth, Fort Harker, that area. The town of Dodge City was established in 1872, I think it was. And then every time the railroad built a little bit farther west, then the trail got shorter. And so, there would be goods hauled by rail to wherever the rails ended, and then they get transferred onto the wagons to get transported on from there. Until eventually 1880, the railroad finally reached Santa Fe. And that was the end of the Santa Fe Trail in terms of the active commerce on the trail. But there was a lot that happened in those 60 years in between 1821 and 1880 that really had a major impact on this part of the nation and the nation as a whole. So I was kind of surprised myself just how significant it was. And there's a lot to it, and I'm no expert on the trail. Leo Oliva and people like that, people I interviewed, really do know the story. Jenny Chen at the State Historical Society, the director, helped out a lot in telling the story. And Fran Levine, who I showed there as the director of the Missouri Historical Society, she previously was the director of the New Mexico History Museum in Santa Fe, so she's seen things from both ends of the trail. She actually has fallen in love with the Flint Hills in the last few months because she came to Council Grove to attend Symphony in the Flint Hills this last summer, and she'd never been here before, and she was just blown away by the tallgrass prairie. And so she's coming back in April to give a presentation at the Council presentation that they have on a monthly basis in Council Grove, talking about women on the Santa Fe Trail. So if you're looking for something to do on a Sunday afternoon in April, I don't know exactly which one, but Fran Levine will be there talking about women on the Santa Fe Trail. And they're having monthly programs down there now on various topics related to trail history. And I'll be there, I think, in September to do a full screening of the show, the documentary, which I feel a little bit cheated. The previous documentaries, I said we had the public screenings in Emporia and Manhattan. I was planning to do something similar with this, but then with COVID, it just did not feel safe to bring a number of people together inside. So we did have one outdoor screening in Manhattan, which was kind of a gamble because I didn't think of it soon enough to get it when the weather was a little nicer. So we didn't get it in until October, but we had a big inflatable screen out in the Blue Earth Plaza out by the Flint Hills Discovery Center. And we managed to get it in one evening before rain rolled in, but it was kind of a chilly October evening and not too many people ventured out to join us, but it turned out to be a pretty nice presentation because we had this huge screen and a great sound system, and it was kind of appropriate sitting there in the vicinity of the Blue Earth Village, thinking about the history of that space over the past 200 years. And I'm kind of sorry we didn't do a better job of coordinating with the weather and all that sort of thing. But anyhow, you have to roll with the punches with COVID, right? It also affected our production plans for this because Rex and I were going to do some more traveling together out west and along the trail. And when COVID hit, it didn't even feel safe for the two of us to be in a car together. So we had to not do as many productions trips as I'd originally planned. And I made a dash to the western end of the trail to get footage of scenes along the trail out in New Mexico and between here and there. And the day I pulled into Santa Fe, the governor issued a quarantine order for anybody coming in from out of state. So I had 24 hours to get as much footage as I could in Santa Fe before I headed up into Colorado. You have to adapt, and we've done that today here, haven't we?
We have. It's lucky you are a descendant of sturdy and adventurous stock because it served you well this last couple of years to keep it going. And so we appreciate you and your talent and your efforts. It's been a lot of fun.
Well, I hope it's been worthwhile and interesting for you guys. I thought it was kind of fun to take a look back at what we'd done on Konza Prairie before in the past, and I appreciate having the opportunity to use that as a site of the interview with Jim Chereau, who, as you may know, has now headed north the border to British Columbia and is no longer available for an interview in most cases.
But Jim Chereau,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So,
well, great.
But anyhow, if anybody's interested in seeing more, like I said, prairiehollow.net is the name of our website, and you can go there. And I've got short videos up, like what you've seen today, as well as being able to stream it online and or order a DVD. A DVD order came in a little bit ago. So hey,
perfect. Thank you so much. And everyone on the chat is saying thank you as well. So we appreciate your time and your energy and your talents on this beautiful day.
We got a little bit of sunlight yet.
Yeah. So go outside and enjoy it. And I think that's it. I think that's all we have for y'all. Thank you for joining us today on the Cure for Cabin Fever. Yeah, go ahead.
I do have one last video. It's about 3 minutes long. And if that's not asking too much, it's kind of a nice little musical interlude, or not interlude, a way to conclude with some nice music and some scenes of the western end of the trail.
Please.
You know, I think a National Historic Trail is such a great way to bring history into focus. I hope that we can tell a deeper story with the National Historic Trails. I think that telling the story of the Native peoples who were there, telling the story of the environmental changes that have happened across the U.S. from that contact, I think that the trails are more than just marking a line on the map. I think it's about telling that story of people coming together, about the nation growing, about the impact that that contact has had. That's the importance of the National Historic Trails. It gets people out, gets people thinking, shakes them up a little bit. That's what marries your understanding of history to an understanding of this country, is when you get out and experience it.
The Santa Fe National Historic Trail encompasses a number of nationally registered historic sites and scenes connected to the landscape through which all the different branches of the trail pass, stretching from central Missouri to the city of Santa Fe itself. It crosses through densely populated urban environments and passes by remote outposts in rural areas as well, with opportunities along the way to journey back in time and engage with the remnants of the trail that can still be found and experienced firsthand.